Welcome children. In the previous chapter, we read about how tribal societies manage their affairs. You would also have heard about kings and emperors who ruled large kingdoms. Let us find out today as to how these kingdoms came into existence. Let me ask you a question. Suppose you and your family and friends suddenly landed in a different planet. What are the things you would look for to make a home? Correct. Water, rich soil for growing food, shelter from rains. Yes, maybe caves or trees to protect you.
That is exactly what the earlier settlers of India did. These are the Aryans. Their original settlements were in the Punjab region. Gradually, from around 1500 BC, they started moving eastward towards the rivers Ganga and Yamuna. You can identify the cities that are located along the rivers. These cities became popular, grew in trade and agriculture, and were important to everyone.
Can you tell me why these became popular? Okay, see, the Ganga and Yamuna rivers flow between the Himalayan mountains and the hills of Deccan Plateau, carrying silt which makes the soil very fertile. It also rains a lot here in the plains. This fertile soil of the plains around and along the rivers made it easy for these settlers to make their homes here, plant crops, plow fields and practice agriculture throughout the year. These people who settled down are called Janas, meaning tribes, and the place where they settled down was called Janapadas, meaning foothold of a tribe. These Janas began settling down along these rivers in large numbers some 1500 years ago. They cut down the forest with the help of an iron tools and tilled the land to grow paddy and other crops using plows pulled by oxes and other farm animals. Large villages and towns developed in these parts, and they were inhabited by many people probably belonging to many different tribes. You see, people must have come from different places, not only Punjab. People from different tribes, different customs and different languages. What they had in common was this rich soil which gave them food. So they all wanted to settle around it. Large group of such villages and towns was in turn called Mahajanapadas, meaning the great foothold of tribes.
Can you see the various areas that became Mahajanapadas? It's almost like a big metropolis like Mumbai or Hyderabad in today's day and age.
Make a list of all the big settlements that you saw in the map. There are 16 of them. You might ask this question as to how do we know so much about people who lived 2700 years ago? Can anyone answer that? That's good. Yes, there are two ways that we can find out about old civilizations. One is by the remains found during archaeological excavations, and the second is by going through the documentations, writings and cave paintings made by the people then. A lot of books were written by educated people in those days. Most were religious books written by Brahmins, Jains and Buddhists, but these books did contain valuable information about the people who lived in those days, the places and the things they did. Some books were written by foreigners who visited the country like Greeks, Romans and Portuguese, even Chinese. They wrote about not only the people but also their rulers and chieftains.
Some important archaeological sites of the time of Mahajanapadas are Delhi, Atranjikhera, Kaushambi, Patna, Ayodhya and Rajgir. A lot of valuable findings were made in these places which help us to understand the times back then.
Some of the famous books written in those times were Upanishads, Dharma Sutras, Digha Nikaya, Majjhima Nikaya, Herodotus' History and Strabo, etc. Now let us do an exercise. Take out your pens and papers. Tell me what are the things that archaeologists will find if they were to dig up a 2000-year-old site. Now your teacher will take your answers and let's see what you have come up with. Well, let's talk about the villages in these big Mahajanapadas. The same way that farming is done by farmers who either own their land and work themselves along with laborers in their fields, in those days also agriculture was managed by Grihapatis or landowners. These landowners worked with their family members on the fields. They also employed slaves who were probably captured in wars and sold to farmers and also poorer people who took jobs as laborers in return for food, grain or wages. These people were known as Bharatakas. Some of these landowners were bigger than others. They were made the head of these villages in order to maintain peace, law and order and also to collect taxes on behalf of the kings of the kingdom. Other communities also slowly developed in these villages. Persons who could do specific work that helped the farmers like blacksmiths who made tools necessary for agriculture or potters who made pots for cooking, weavers who wove cloth for the villages and carpenters who made furnitures. Now, can we take a minute and come up with the things that the blacksmiths, the potters, the weavers and carpenters could do specifically? These different communities also depended on the Grihapatis or landowners for the food which they got in return from the items they made. These villages were very similar to the tribal villages we have in today's age, like for example the Gond tribals who live in the peninsular region of India, mainly AP, Madhya Pradesh and Orissa. These tribes are usually farming communities who have a head of the village who also may be a landowner, like in the olden days of the Mahajanapadas. They also wear simple clothes like dhotis and saris and eat food like millet and leafy vegetables. The only difference between these tribes and the olden tribes is probably that they don't have to pay taxes to a king but are ruled by laws of the state governments who are now giving special status to such tribes by allowing them reservation and seats in schools and colleges in order to bring them up economically. Next, we will look at the cities of the Mahajanapadas. Who do you think lived in these cities? The farmers and the communities that worked closely with the farmers lived in the villages to be near the fields and the soil which they were working on. In the cities that came up around the villages were a whole lot of other communities. Can you try and guess what kind of people stayed in the cities far away from the villages and fields? Well, some of them were slaves and servants while most of them were craft persons who made goods for sale. A lot of the excess farm produce would be brought to these cities to sell to people from other similar cities. So, traders and merchants would come here to exchange their own goods for something they needed. So many other types of goods started to get made for selling like beautiful pottery, fine cloth which were brought by rich people of other Mahajanapadas, exquisite vessels, jewelries, tools made of copper, bronze and other metals, ivory products and so on. Apart from these skilled people, there were also other professionals who lived in these cities like soldiers, accountants, masons, horse trainers, sweepers, water carriers, wood and ivory carvers, and other people. The rich traders also lived in these cities in palatial buildings with dozens of servants and slaves serving them. They made their profits from buying things from one Mahajanapadas and selling it to another Mahajanapadas. They took their merchandise in canvas with lots of animals like ox, donkeys and camels and traveled for weeks and months across the rivers, plains, hills and deserts to sell their merchandise. This is also how goods manufactured in one part of the country, say the Deccan Peninsula, were found during excavations in a totally different region, say the northern part of the Ganga River. Whereas articles written in the books from that time gave us information about the life of these people lived. As we discussed earlier, most of the Mahajanapadas were ruled by kings. These kings had an army of their own to ensure that people followed their orders and also to protect them from people from invasion from other rulers. The kings lived in capital cities which were protected physically by strong fortresses of wood, stone, brick and mud. A big city meant a lot of expenses in order to look after the soldiers and their families, the brickmakers who made lakhs of bricks to build the walls of a kingdom, the innumerable laborers who helped to construct these public buildings. How do you think the kings found money to pay for all these expenses? Exactly. They collected taxes from all the people and these were taken from the Grahapatis who were the landowners. Nobody could refuse to pay a king taxes or they would face severe punishments. Remember, I asked you what was the difference between the tribes of today and Mahajanapadas of ancient times. Well, apart from the points we already discussed, the Gond chiefs or Patlas were not always able to collect taxes or money from the whole community unless the people agreed to give the taxes. For example, if there was a common festival or guests that were being entertained, everyone may have contributed, but not always. Whereas, in the case of kings, the soldiers were very strict about collecting taxes in return for protection of the king, so nobody refused. Now, the kings wanted to be more powerful and wealthy. They could do this in two ways. Firstly, by increasing the taxes on their subjects and secondly, by conquering neighboring kingdoms. Let us now talk about the taxes. How do you think taxes were collected? We have already mentioned that the king's soldiers would collect taxes from the landowners or Grahapatis. What exactly did they do? Well, different communities paid their taxes in different ways. The Grahapatis had to divide their crops into 6 equal parts and give one part or bhaga to the king. The craftsmen would work for a day or a month free of charge for the king. Cattle and poultry owners may be required to handling over a part of the produce like milk or eggs. Traders were also made to pay taxes on the goods they sold. Hunters and gatherers in the nearby forest areas too had to bring forest produce like hides, wood, etc. During this period, the use of coins had just begun. Some of the taxes were probably in the form of coins also. Just like we have taxes today and we do not like to pay them, do we? But we do, because the government uses the money collected from taxes to build better roads, give us better municipal facilities and other infrastructure. In the same way, kings also levied taxes in return for protection and improving peaceful existence. In order to pay taxes, and managed to live properly, that is, earn enough to feed themselves well, people were encouraged to work harder, grow more crops, produce more pots, traders were made to sell more merchandise, and generally business also improved and the kings also became wealthy. The other way kings became wealthy was by constantly waging wars against each other so that they could bring more territories under their rule. When they defeated another kingdom, they also got the Grahapatis and all their farmlands and produce for their own kingdom.